6 days after my father died, I took his old watch to a jeweler and learned it had stopped on May 12th, 1968. May 12 is my birthday. The problem was, I wasn't born until 17 years later. The jeweler turned the watch over, opened the back, and went completely quiet. Someone had scratched 3 things into the metal: GH, the date 5/12/68, and one sentence: "I'm sorry they took you." I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. Then he handed me an old repair slip that had been folded behind the mechanism for nearly 60 years. My father's name was on it. Under customer request, the jeweler had written, "Do not repair. Owner wants watch to remain stopped." I drove straight to my mother's house and put the watch on her kitchen table. She looked at the frozen hands, then at me, and whispered, "Your father promised me you would never find out this way." That was when I realized the strange thing about my father's watch wasn't that it had stopped on my birthday. It was that my parents had spent 41 years hoping I would never ask why. My name is Laura Hayes. I was 41 when my father, Robert, died at 77. He had been the kind of man people described as dependable because they didn't know a better word for someone who never missed a mortgage payment, never forgot to change the furnace filter, and would drive across town at midnight if your car wouldn't start. He rarely said, "I love you," unless someone else said it first. He repaired things instead. That was his language. If I was upset, Dad would tighten a loose cabinet hinge, check my tires, or appear the next morning with a new smoke detector. His weakness was that he believed fixing a problem and talking about it were the same thing. They weren't, and the watch would prove just how much damage silence could hide. I had seen the watch my entire childhood. It was a stainless steel Hamilton with a cracked crystal and faded leather strap. Dad kept it in the top drawer of his dresser beside his cufflinks. He never wore it. Whenever I asked why he kept a broken watch, he gave the same answer: "Some things don't need to work to matter." As a child, I thought that sounded wise. As an adult, I realized it was the kind of sentence people use when the real answer is too dangerous. After his funeral, Mom gave me a wooden box containing his personal things. The watch was inside, and for the first time I noticed the tiny date window beside the frozen hands. It read 12. My birthday was May 12. I smiled at the coincidence until I found the engraving inside the case, and suddenly coincidence felt like a warning. My mother, Helen, was 72. She loved fiercely but possessively. If you told her you were driving somewhere, she wanted to know what route you planned to take. If I didn't answer a text within an hour, she imagined hospitals. Her weakness was fear disguised as care. When I placed the watch in front of her, she pushed it away as though it might burn her. "Who opened it?" she asked. I told her about the jeweler. Then I asked the name that had been running through my head since I left the shop. "Who was GH?" Mom gripped the edge of the table. "Laura, your father is gone. Let him be gone." That was not an answer. It was confirmation that GH had been real. I pressed harder. "Was she someone he loved?" Mom looked toward the kitchen window. "Yes." My stomach tightened. "Before you?" She swallowed. "Before me." I assumed I had uncovered an old girlfriend. Then Mom said, "But not the way you think." She refused to explain anything else, so that night I searched Dad's study. Behind a row of tax binders, I found an envelope with one word written across it in his handwriting: Grace. Inside was a photograph of my father at 36, standing beside a pregnant teenage girl. The picture was dated May 1985. I was born that same month, and the girl in the photograph had my face. The resemblance was not subtle. Grace had my eyes, my narrow chin, and the same crooked left eyebrow I had spent years blaming on Dad. She looked about 17. Dad stood beside her with one hand resting awkwardly on her shoulder, and she leaned toward him with the exhausted trust of someone who had stopped pretending she was fine. On the back, Dad had written, "Grace, 1 week to go, don't lose her twice." That sentence changed the first story I had built in my head. Grace was not simply an old girlfriend from 1968. In 1985, she was young enough to be Dad's daughter. I found 3 letters in the envelope. The first began, "Dear Robert, I don't know if I'm supposed to call you Dad." My hands went cold. Grace wrote that she had recently obtained part of her adoption file. She knew Robert Hayes was listed as her biological father. She was 16, pregnant, and terrified that her adoptive mother would send her to a maternity home. "I know you signed me away," she wrote. "Maybe you had a reason, but I won't let them take my baby from me the way they took me from you." The letter was dated November 1984. Dad had received it 6 months before I was born, and suddenly I understood who GH was. Grace Hayes had been his first daughter. The second letter was angry. Grace accused Dad of trying to control her. She said he kept talking about doctors, lawyers, and doing this properly, when all she wanted was someone to listen. That sounded painfully familiar. Dad had always responded to fear by creating a plan. Grace's weakness seemed to be the opposite. The more frightened she became, the more stubborn she got. She wrote, "You keep trying to save me like I'm a problem. I need you to stand beside me, not manage me." I could almost hear myself saying the same thing to him 20 years later. But the third letter was different. It contained only 7 lines. "I'm sorry about yesterday. I know you're trying. The doctor says the baby is healthy. May 12 is still the plan if my blood pressure behaves. Maybe that date can mean something good this time. Please bring the watch. I want to see it. May 12, my birthday." I read the sentence again. Grace was scheduled to have a baby on May 12, 1985, exactly 17 years after the date engraved inside Dad's frozen watch. I sat on the floor of his study and stared at the photograph. Dad had a pregnant 17-year-old daughter. She was due on the day I was born. There was only one obvious conclusion, but I didn't want to say it out loud. I pulled out my birth certificate instead. Mother, Helen Hayes. Father, Robert Hayes. Everything looked normal. Then I noticed a line I had ignored my entire life. Certificate amended, August 7, 1985. My birth record had been changed 3 months after I was born, and nobody had ever told me why. Mom stopped answering my calls, so I did what Dad had trained me to do when emotion became unbearable. I turned it into a task. I searched Grace's name. Grace Morgan appeared in an old high school yearbook from Dayton. A memorial notice listed her death as May 14, 1985. She had died 2 days after my birthday. No obituary mentioned a child. No surviving parents were listed, only beloved daughter of Margaret and James Morgan. Robert Hayes did not appear anywhere. I searched Margaret Morgan next. She was 86 and living in an assisted care community 40 miles away. I almost didn't go. Part of me was terrified she would confirm what I already suspected. Another part was more frightened she would tell me I was wrong. Margaret agreed to see me after I said Robert's name. When I walked into her room, she stared at my face for several seconds. Then she whispered, "You look more like Grace every year." I had never met this woman before, yet she had apparently been watching me age from a distance. Margaret had adopted Grace in 1968. She and her husband could not have children. She admitted they had been strict, especially after Grace became a teenager. Margaret's weakness was control. She had spent her life believing love meant preventing bad choices, even if prevention required deciding for someone else. She told me Grace's biological mother had been an 18-year-old named Diane Hall. Robert was 19. Diane's parents considered the pregnancy a disgrace. Robert wanted to marry her. Diane wanted to keep the baby. Neither family allowed it. Grace was born on May 12, 1968. Robert was at the hospital. He held her for less than 10 minutes. Then Diane's father arrived with the adoption papers already arranged. Robert tried to stop them from taking Grace from the nursery. There was shouting. Someone pushed him against a door. His watch struck the metal frame and shattered. The hands stopped at 8:17 p.m. He could have repaired it, Margaret said. He chose not to. The next morning, Robert had the date, and Grace's initials scratched into the back. The watch became the minute his daughter disappeared from his life. I asked the question that mattered. Why did Grace contact him 17 years later? Margaret looked ashamed. Grace had discovered she was adopted after finding documents in a locked cabinet. She was furious that Margaret had hidden the truth. Then she became pregnant. The baby's father was another teenager who panicked and disappeared. Margaret tried to arrange a private adoption. She believed she was saving Grace from repeating Diane's life. Grace ran away and contacted Robert instead. "I made the exact mistake I always blamed Diane's parents for," Margaret whispered. "I loved her so much, I decided her life belonged to me." For the first time, I saw how the same fear could travel through different families, wearing different faces. Then I asked, "Did Grace have the baby?" Margaret looked directly at me. "Yes." My heartbeat became painful. "What happened to her?" Margaret's eyes filled. "You already know." That was the moment my birth certificate stopped feeling like proof and started feeling like evidence. I drove to Mom's house with Grace's letters on the passenger seat. This time she opened the door before I knocked. She looked as if she had aged 10 years since the day before. I put the amended birth certificate on her table. "Tell me who gave birth to me." Mom began crying. I hated that part of me still wanted to comfort her. "Grace," she said. One word rearranged my entire life. Robert Hayes was not my biological father. He was my grandfather. Helen Hayes was not my biological mother. She was the woman who adopted me after marrying my grandfather. And Grace, the teenage girl whose photograph had been hidden behind tax records, was my mother. I stood so quickly the chair scraped backward. 41 years. Mom reached toward me. I stepped away. You let me believe my mother was my sister. She flinched. We never called her your sister. You didn't call her anything. That's worse. Mom told me the rest. Grace developed severe preeclampsia late in pregnancy. Doctors scheduled an induction for May 12. They offered May 11 or May 13, but Grace chose her own 17th birthday. She told Robert she wanted the date he had lost her to become the date he got family back. I was born shortly after noon. Grace survived the delivery, but suffered complications the following night. She died on May 14. Before she died, she made Robert promise I would not be surrendered for adoption. No strangers, she told him. No sealed files, no disappearing, Robert promised. He and Helen had been married 3 years and had already suffered 2 miscarriages. They applied to adopt me within days. The adoption became final that summer. My birth certificate was amended to list them as my parents, which was legal. What was not required was the lie that followed. Why didn't you tell me when I was older? Mom wiped her face. At first we thought 5 was too young, then 10. Then your father said we should wait until you were old enough to understand death. At 16, I begged him not to tell you because I was terrified you would decide Grace was your real mother and I was nothing. There it was. Not protection. Not entirely. Fear. You were my mother, I said. You didn't need the lie. I know that now. Did Dad? Mom looked toward the hallway where his coat had hung for 30 years. Sometimes. That answer hurt more than if she had defended him. Then she brought me a cassette tape. Grace made this after you were born. Dad had kept it hidden for 41 years. I had never heard my biological mother speak. That realization frightened me more than any document had. Mom still owned an old cassette player because Dad refused to throw anything away that might someday be useful. The tape hissed for several seconds. Then a teenage girl laughed weakly. Is it recording? My father's younger voice answered, yes. Grace said, you sound terrified. So do you. I just had a baby. I'm allowed. Then she laughed again. I pressed both hands against my mouth. Grace talked about me. She said I had dark hair, long fingers, and an angry little face. She joked that Robert already held me like I was made of glass. Then her voice became serious. If anything happens to me, you keep her. Dad immediately interrupted. Nothing is happening to you. Robert. Silence. You keep her. Helen too, if she wants her. Mom began crying beside me. Then Grace said something neither of us expected. But you tell her about me. Mom closed her eyes. When? When she's old enough to ask where she came from. Grace paused. Don't make me disappear. I stopped the tape. For several seconds, I could hear only the kitchen clock. Dad had not misunderstood Grace. He had broken her final request. Mom whispered, I'm sorry. I pressed play again. Grace told Dad she did not want me growing up thinking she had abandoned me. She wanted me to know she had chosen to keep me. She wanted me to know that Margaret had loved her despite everything, and that Robert had come when she called. Tell her nobody in this story is completely bad, Grace said. We're just all scared people making decisions too big for us. I almost laughed through my tears. At 17, my mother understood the entire family better than the adults surrounding her. The recording ended with Dad saying, I promise. I looked at Mom. He promised twice. She nodded. He kept the first promise and broke the second. That became the moral center of everything I learned next. Dad had saved me from being separated from family. Then he separated me from the truth. For weeks, I could not decide what to call Robert in my own head. Grandfather sounded biologically correct and emotionally absurd. Dad felt emotionally true and factually incomplete. I became angry whenever someone said I had been lucky he adopted me. Gratitude felt like another demand to forgive before I was ready. Then I found one final folder in his desk. It contained letters addressed to me. He had written one when I turned 10, one when I turned 16, one before I left for college, one the week before my wedding. He never gave me any of them. Each began differently and ended the same way. I need to tell you about Grace. Dad had spent decades preparing to tell the truth and failing at the final step. The last letter was dated 2 months before he died. Laura, I used to tell myself I kept the truth because I wanted to protect you. That stopped being true a long time ago. The truth is that I became afraid you would learn Grace was your mother, look at me and see only the man who failed her twice. I was afraid you would stop calling me Dad. I sat at his desk for almost an hour after reading that sentence. There was his weakness in its purest form. Dad did not hide Grace only because he thought the truth would hurt me. He hid her because the truth threatened him. That did not erase the hundreds of mornings he packed my lunch. It did not erase him sitting beside my hospital bed when I had pneumonia at 9. It did not erase the way he cried secretly in the garage after walking me down the aisle. But love did not erase the lie either. Both had to remain true. At the bottom of the folder was an address for a man named Ryan Cole, Grace's teenage boyfriend, my presumed biological father. I almost threw it away. Then I remembered my own weakness. I could not live beside an unanswered question, so I contacted him. Ryan was 58 and owned a plumbing business in Kentucky. When I said Grace's name, his voice changed. I wondered if you'd ever call. He admitted he had been 17 and terrified. Grace told him she was pregnant. He denied responsibility and stopped answering her calls. I was a coward, he said. I've had 40 years to improve the wording, but that's still the right word. Then he surprised me. I'm not your father. Grace had told him that shortly before leaving Dayton. I asked who was. Ryan said, I thought Robert knew. Another secret had survived everyone who created it. I searched Grace's letters again. No father's name appeared anywhere. Mom insisted Robert had believed Ryan was responsible. Margaret said Grace refused to discuss it. For the first time, I considered something painful. Perhaps Grace had chosen to keep one secret of her own. Then Margaret called me. There's something I didn't give you. She had found an envelope in Grace's old belongings after our meeting. On the front was written, "For my daughter someday." Inside was a letter Grace had written the week before I was born. She explained that my biological father was not Ryan. His name was Michael Avery. He had been 21, a mechanic at a garage near Grace's school. They had dated secretly because Margaret would never have approved of an older boyfriend. When Grace became pregnant, Michael wanted to marry her. Grace refused. At first, I thought I had found another man who failed her. Then I kept reading. Michael had not abandoned Grace. Grace left him. She believed marriage at 17 would turn one frightening situation into another permanent decision. She wanted Michael involved with the baby, but did not want to belong to him. Michael became angry and threatened to seek custody once I was born. Grace panicked and disappeared to Robert's house without telling him where she had gone. That was Grace's weakness. When she felt trapped, she ran before anyone could choose for her. The letter said she intended to contact Michael after I was born. She never got the chance. I searched his name. Michael Avery had died in 2009. He had never married. His obituary listed one surviving sister. I called her. When I told her who I was, she began to cry. Michael had spent years searching for Grace and the baby. He eventually discovered Grace had died, but the adoption records were sealed and my new name was protected. He never knew Robert had adopted me. He kept something, his sister said. 3 days later, a package arrived. Inside was a tiny knitted blanket, one photograph of Michael and Grace together, and an unopened birthday card. The envelope read, "For my daughter, May 12, 1986, age 1. Michael had bought me birthday cards for 18 years. He never knew where to send them. My family had not hidden one parent from me. They had accidentally hidden 2. Yet the strongest truth was still waiting inside Dad's watch. I went back to the jeweler who had opened the watch. I want it repaired, I told him. He studied me. Are you sure? For 41 years, everyone else had decided what I could handle. I smiled bitterly. No, but do it anyway. A week later, he called. When I arrived, the watch was running. For the first time since 1968, the second hand moved. But the jeweler had found something beneath the original repair slip, folded so tightly it looked like part of the backing, a piece of hospital stationery. Dad had written on it the night Grace was born, May 12, 1968. I held my daughter today for 9 minutes. He described her tiny hand closing around his finger. He described Diane crying. He described being told he was 19 and had no right to ruin everyone's future. Then, they took her at 8:17. My watch broke when I hit the nursery door. I asked the jeweler not to fix it because I need one thing in my life to admit that this happened. I felt tears begin. The final paragraph was written in different ink, added 17 years later, May 12, 1985. Today Grace gave birth to Laura, my name. Grace asked why I still carry the broken watch. I told her it was the minute I lost my daughter. She took it from my hand and said, "Then stop being dramatic and make it the minute you found her again." I laughed through my tears. That sounded like the mother I had begun to know through paper and tape. Dad continued, "She wants me to repair it. I told her I would after she comes home from the hospital." Grace never came home, so Dad never repaired the watch. For 41 years, I had assumed it marked the moment something ended. It didn't. It marked 2 moments. The day Dad lost Grace, and 17 years later, the day Grace came back long enough to give him me. That was why he left it stopped, not because he wanted to live inside tragedy. Because he could never decide whether May 12 was the worst day of his life or the best. The answer, I finally understood, was both. On my 42nd birthday, I wore Dad's watch. Mom came to dinner, so did Margaret. Ryan sent a card even though we had no biological connection. Michael's sister mailed me one of the birthday cards he had bought decades earlier. Before dessert, Mom looked at the watch moving on my wrist. Your father would have hated that you fixed it. I smiled. No, I think he would have been scared. She laughed softly. There was a difference. I looked at the second hand crossing the place where it had been frozen for nearly 60 years. 8:17 came and went. Nothing terrible happened. Time continued. That was the part my family had never understood. Keeping a watch stopped does not preserve the people you lost. Keeping a secret does not protect the people you love. Eventually someone inherits both. I spent most of my life believing my father's greatest strength was that he never abandoned anyone. I learned after his death that staying can have its own form of cowardice. Robert stayed for Grace. He stayed for me. He loved us both fiercely. But when truth threatened the family he had fought to keep, he hid behind silence. Helen loved me enough to become my mother, then feared losing that title so much she helped erase the woman who gave birth to me. Margaret tried to protect Grace by controlling her. Grace protected her freedom by running. Even Michael lost years because fear and sealed records kept him outside my life. None of them were monsters. None of them were innocent either. Maybe families are not divided into people who hurt us and people who love us. Sometimes the same person does both. The question is what we choose to pass on after we finally know the truth. If you were Laura, would you forgive Robert and Helen for raising you as their daughter but hiding Grace for 41 years? Do you think Robert kept his promise by giving Laura a loving home, or broke the promise that mattered most when he erased her mother's story? And would you have repaired the watch, or left it frozen at 8:17? Write what you would have done in the comments.